a special presentation of 1837, the Farmers Revolt, a panel discussion.
All right, cut to edge of stage. Great. All right, color frost.
Check. 1, 2, 3. Check.
Stand by, please. House to half, house out, letting cues 1 through 10, down cues 1 through 10.
Welcome back to The Title Block, a podcast about Canadian theatre designers, their history, and their craft. I am, of course, your host, Michael Kruse, and this time, another special presentation about Canadian theatre history, a panel discussion from Blyth, Ontario, about 1837, the Farmers Revolt. Yes, we once again return to my happy place, Blyth, Ontario, where on July 18th, 2018, Blyth Artistic Director Gil Garratt and local historian David Yates sat down with moderator Christopher Spallata to talk about the history of the current production of Blyth Festival's 1837, The Farmers Revolt. This is more of a discussion about the history surrounding the play and the circumstances in the 19th century in southwestern Ontario than the actual production of Blyth, but it's a great discussion nonetheless. Think of it as a palate cleanser before we start up with new interviews with Canadian theatre designers in September. And a special thanks to Beth Kates, who recorded this discussion and managed all the permissions down in Blyth. Once again, I want to encourage you to go to patreon.com to support the Title Block to help cover the costs of producing special presentations like this, and I want to thank those of you who support the show every month. If you have any comments about the show, please forward them to thetitleBlock@gmail.com or contact us through Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. And now we join Christopher, Gil, and David as they delve into 19th century Canadian history of 1837, the Farmers' Revolt.
Hey, welcome. Welcome to the museum on this sunny, hot evening in Goderich. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Tonight we have a discussion panel about the new upcoming play at the Blyth Festival, Farmers Revolt, 1837. It deals with a rebellion that happened in Ontario at the time called Upper Canada. With us tonight we have the artistic director of the Blyth Festival, Gil Garratt. Gil is not only the artistic director, he is also an actor and director in his own right, and a winner of this year's Huron Arts and Heritage Network Individual Artist Award. With him on stage we have David Yates. David Yates is a recently retired teacher. He is a local historian. We can give him a round of applause for that. He's a historian, and he has been writing articles about our local history in the Signal Star for over a decade now. So we're very happy to have him with us tonight. Thank you. I'm Christopher Spallata. I'm going to be the moderator for this evening's discussion. I'm going to be asking some questions of our panelists, and at any time, if you feel that you would like to ask a question of the panelists, don't hesitate. You can put up your hand, and we can try to get your questions in as soon as possible, rather than holding questions for the end, so that we can have this be interactive. So feel free to chime in. I hope that's all right with our guests.
Yeah, or if you have a better answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
More of a comment than a question.
That too. So without any further ado, I think we'll jump right into it. So first off, I'd like to ask, what was the rebellion of 1837? Can you put it in historical context for us?
Okay, well,
I'm going to let you go first.
Well, from a historical perspective, it is an incredibly important event in Upper Canadian history. What it was about was a variety of reasons. No doubt the grievances that the rebels and the reformers had were legitimate, like the cronyism, the jobbery, the corruption of the family compact, the clergy reserves, were all legitimate grievances. But what came to armed rebellion, the rebellion itself had very little popular support. And we'll look at that maybe in more detail later. But overall, it was a sort of a fight for responsible government, but on a deeper, maybe some would say, the Tories would say darker motivation. It was about making Canada a republic, okay? Which republicanism in that decade in the 1830s, remember their frame of reference. The War of 1812 was had just ended a little more than 20 years later. The French Revolution, republicanism to people living in Upper Canada, the 1820s and 30s and 40s, and maybe up, they associate it with the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, and the specter of the guillotine was in the back of everybody's mind. So when you have people like Lyon Mackenzie supporting a Republican style of government, people at the time bridled, even people who were legitimate reformers who were prepared to fight against, maybe not with an armed rebellion, but to protest against the government's corruption. Even people like that would have stopped short of advocating a Republican form of government. I suspect had the rebellion have worked or had it succeeded, today we'd be celebrating 180 years of American liberty under President Trump, which for a lot of people might not be the ideal situation. But probably at the time in 1837, 38, a lot of the rebels themselves were probably mixed in their motives of why they took up arms against the state. Some actually, rather than wanting to overthrow British tyranny, actually were demanding their rights as British citizens of responsible government, parliamentary democracy. Others, as I said, like Lyon Mackenzie himself and Dr. Charles Duncombe from around the London area, they were outright Republicans. And they would have been quite happy had Canada been annexed to the United States.
So can you tell us what actually happened on the day or few days of this rebellion? Maybe Gil?
Well, I want to bring a question back to David there too. So when you say that that the rebellion did not have a lot of popular support, do you mean in terms of the number of people engaged?
No, it didn't have a lot of popular support in the number of people who were willing to take up arms against the state. I think the reform movement, you have to divide it up between reformers. The great Egerton Ryerson, the founder of public education, and Robert Baldwin were reformers who fought the family compact, who were advocates of, like I said, public education and political reform. But when it came to taking up arms against the crown, they were right out of it. And remember, treason in that day and age, which is what, when the rebels took up arms, that's what they were committing. That was the highest crime you can commit. It's a more serious offense than murder. In fact, in the Criminal Code of Canada, the death penalty for treason wasn't repealed until 1997, 20 odd years after it had been repealed for first-degree murder.
Actually, before we go on with that, why don't we back up a minute? And I assume that there are a lot of people who are interested in history here, but there might be some who don't know what the family compact was, what situation people were living in at that time. Could you describe that for us briefly?
In a nutshell, the family compact were essentially all of the top tiers of government in Upper Canada at that time were essentially either blood relations or related by marriage, and it was essentially a series of little fiefdoms that were controlled by these intimate family relations, and there were tremendous abuses of power. I mean, they would appoint their own brothers and their own brothers-in-law to incredible positions, or their own sons, and give them multiple positions within the government too, so that you could have individuals who were in power who might be, in charge of. Everything from the judiciary to every major body that was governing the people of the day, and it was literally all blood relations, the family compact.
And how did they get into that situation? Were they appointed? Were they elected?
Well, I mean, if you could call them elections.
Well, actually, the family compact goes back to the sort of the aristocrat, and you go back to the American Revolution once again, and the waves of loyalists that came into Upper Canada from the United States. a lot of them were upper middle class to begin with, and part of it has to do with our idea of what governance was. Remember, Ontario was a counter-revolutionary state. Does anyone know what the provincial motto is? Anyone? Oh, loyal she began, loyal she remains. And right from the beginning in the 1790s, when the last of the Loyalist migrations entered the province, a lot of families established themselves. They saw themselves as setting up a counter-revolutionary state against what was happening in the United States. And pretty soon, a small knot of families rose to the top and tried to emulate, and some would say, like the British gentry or aristocracy, and they felt entitled because they took on, a lot of them were really well educated. The talent ranged in the early days from really, really sharp and competent, like Bishop John Strachan, sharp, competent, on-the-ball guy, to outright corrupt buffoonery, basically, at the highest levels. And by the 1830s, it got to the point where it couldn't be ignored anymore. It was the dead hand of reform on anything happening in Upper Canada.
So now, at the time that there was this wave of loyalists moving in, how many people were coming up from the United States into Ontario compared to people already living there, having emigrated from England?
Yeah, I mean, really, at that point in time, there was a massive out-migration. Like, a lot of people were leaving Upper Canada for the United States, too. I mean, it was happening in droves. At that time, they talk about America receiving as much as 2,000 immigrants a day, and the bulk of them would be coming from Upper Canada.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, amazingly, America practiced unrestricted immigration. That was something they encouraged in the first half of the 19th century. They didn't take care of where you were from. And in Upper Canada, as I said, some of them were really, going back to who these people were, I want to just pick up on John Strachan. He becomes, for a lot of them, their families had distinguished themselves in the War of 1812 and felt that their defense of Upper Canada entitled them to govern. Governors from England come and go, but the family compact or the Chateau clique in Lower Canada, it stuck around, and they felt that they had a vested interest. Bishop John Strachan was a gutsy guy. He rode while the Americans invaded York in Upper Canada in 1813, and they burned the Parliament buildings, and they were running around with torches, burning Yonge Street and down on what's Front Street now, what was left of York. He rode into the midst of the invading army and demanded to know what was going on, and demanded that they douse their torches because these were civilian homes. And amazingly, they listened to him. That moment, for a lot of people in Upper Canada, even if they didn't like the family compact that developed 25 years later, will point to that moment that John Strachan rode down Yonge Street and into the advancing Americans and got them to stop doing what they were doing. So some of them were really competent, but as I said, some were really corrupt. And as Gil has alluded to, they were driving people out of Upper Canada in droves. The Loyalist migration had probably ended by about the early 1790s. It's hard to know for sure, but about 40,000 Loyalists came up from the United States and settled in Upper Canada, mostly in eastern Ontario, around St. Thomas. But by the 1830s, that Loyalist migration had kind of gone the other way, and a lot of migrants coming into Canada were realizing this wasn't nearly, the development in Upper Canada wasn't happening as nearly as quickly as it was in the United States, in the excited states of America, where you get frontier expansion, industrialism by the 1830s and 40s. Everything was happening in the United States even then, whereas Upper Canada seemed to be, the family compact had maybe turned it into a backwater, not very progressive backwater kind of colony of Great Britain.
Yeah, and not only politically, but also, I mean, just in terms of sheer infrastructure too. Like there's a great scene in the play actually where, and I won't give it all away, but a young Canadian goes on a fact-finding mission in the United States. And one of the things that he's struck by is the difference between the Welland Canal and the Erie Canal. And he basically points to, the Welland Canal at that point has taken them 12 years to build, and it's 12 miles long. Whereas the Erie Canal at that point, and that you have to still dig yourself through it, and that the Erie Canal at that point is 500 miles long and clear sailing right through, and really pointing out, these incredible differences. But people grappling, especially in this part of the world, with having no roads, having sometimes roads that went to the edges of watersheds and no bridges. And these essential pieces of how do you actually develop a civilization? How do you develop any kind of a city if that's what you're grappling with? The towns were really isolated in so many ways, and even isolated not only from each other, but even the people living in the country were isolated so badly from the towns themselves, even the towns that they surrounded.
Yeah, and as much as the Huron Road was a tremendous accomplishment that the Van Egmonds had built about 1828-29 to bring immigrants into the Huron tract, it was little more than a goat track that was barely passable on a good day, and when it was rainy, it was just a muddy morass that you'd sank your ox cart up to the axles, and it was more of a problem than a passage. Far easier to get into the Huron tract by the harbor here than it was overland by the Huron Road.
So at the time of this rebellion, we had this family compact who had been kind of dictating what happened in Upper Canada, present-day Ontario. They had been kind of dictating that for years, and people were getting fed up with that and thought that it might be a better idea to start their own country.
Yeah, and the reform movement too had also been and David's pointed to that too. There were these stalwart reformers who tried to, what's that Leonard Cohen line? They sentenced me to 30 years of boredom for trying to change the system from the inside, right? So there was a lot of reformers who went and tried to actually sit in Parliament of the day and tried to make change from the inside, and felt themselves totally isolated and totally shut out. And there's a lot of stuff that Lyon Mackenzie writes about, the number of bills that he tried to put forward, and that every time he would present a bill, a Tory would call for a recess, and the government would be shut down essentially, and that he could never, or felt that he could never forward any of the cause in the halls of power, and was also himself thrown out of government 4 times, but re-elected, again and again and again, because the people wanted his voice at the table, but the table had no ears.
Yes.
So your question about were the people in Family Compact elected or appointed, what was the answer to that?
Well,
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, a lot of them, the governor, and you see within the family compact itself, there are a lot of divisions amongst family. A new governor comes in and his term is at the pleasure of His Majesty or Her Majesty, and they appoint the executive council. There is a legislative assembly which is elected by popular vote, but you had to be an elector. The elections here are very small. I think the first election we had in 1835, there were much fewer than 200 people who were eligible to vote. And you had to go and declare your vote publicly, and you had to be a freeholder. You had to own your own property, not be indebted to somebody else. A British subject, male, 21. And that was as good as it got anywhere. Even the United States, it's pretty much the same, but that was considered and the people that went to the Legislative Assembly, and some Tories like Captain Robert Dunlop, he called himself a British constitutionalist. He's frustrated because he wants to bring in prison reform. He wants to bring in immigration. One of his pet causes, which is why he shows up in the modern age very well, was bringing in the runaway slaves, what he called the freedmen or contraband, and because he saw the runaway slaves that came to places like when Biddulph Township was in Huron County, we had a settlement called Wilberforce, which William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist in the States, came and visited and praised. But Captain Dunlop saw the freed slaves as being a bulwark of loyalty to the British Empire, because the British Empire had abolished slavery, and Canada had become a haven for them. And he was totally right, because during the rebellion, to a man in the freedmen colonies, the former runaway slave colonies in Chatham, Wilberforce, they defend the British. For them, the Union Jack was the flag of liberty, not the Stars and Stripes. And the Executive Council was appointed by the governor himself. And the Executive Council basically governed, ignoring the wishes of the Legislative Assembly, which was elected. The Executive Council was where the power was until about 1841. When we get into that age-old debate that bores Canadian history students forever, when does Canada get responsible government? And you know.
This Executive Council that's appointed by the governors, did the Family Compact have strong ties to Britain? Is that how they kept getting appointed?
Well, I would imagine they were all loyal to a family. And they got appointed because of their position, their rank in mostly Toronto society or York society at the time. But even within the Family Compact, a new governor comes in, and you get he appoints a different executive council. And so I didn't like these guys from the governor's former counselors, so I'm going to appoint my own executive counselor. So there's a lot of power invested in the lieutenant governor of Upper Canada, and he had the power to dismiss and hire the executive council. So if you were in the Family Compact and you wanted to advocate too strongly for certain reforms, you might find your spot at the table jeopardized.
Okay. But they were always choosing from the same
Yeah,
families.
they were always basically. Now, I suppose, I can't think of anybody offhand, but I suppose that there might be an up-and-coming family that a new governor might want to appoint as a favorite or have on side. I'm sure that happened. I just can't think of an example right now.
Okay.
Well, and the election piece too, like another important thing about the elections, like there's a great line in the play where an observer of an election says, and that was an election. How do I know? Because I lost 2 teeth in it. And part of what they talk about is the incredible violence that would also be accompanied by these elections. It was not like you went behind a polite little piece of cardboard at the Holmesville, community center and wrote an X on something. It was people having to stand up on a box in front of a room full of people and be heard. And it was also entirely possible that the person who was responsible for writing down whether you said Reform or Tory was a Tory and hated reformers and wasn't going to write down the fact that you said reform, and might actually it's entirely possible that you could also face reprisal, and that you're also in a room full of people and having to make your way back home down your little gravel road, your little goat track, whatever that is, to try to get back to your house, and you're going to have to go through that same community. It's incredible to put your neck out and stand for change was, I think, incredibly dangerous.
Well, in 1835, our first election here, the electors came with a body of guys armed with clubs and spikes and sort of things. You had a body of people that would come and escort you. Funny enough, they had 100% voter turnout, unlike today. They had the ride days from Brewster Mills or whatever to come into town. Voting was over a 3 or 4 day period. And the violence, even after 1837-38, the election here in 1841, they had to call the army, and a company of infantry and an artillery detachment was sent to Goderich, and they ringed the jail and to break up a riot, and the sound of clicking musket kind of sobered everybody up. And they read the riot act from the cupola in the jail there.
Which also just raises the stakes too. When you think about something then like a William Lyon Mackenzie, who is repeatedly reelected to the legislature, when that's happening, the amount to which people are sticking their neck out to be able to support him, and he was in no way a subtle man, right? I mean, he was someone. There's I won't tell you the whole play, but there's another great line in the play where it's actually Tiger Dunlop says to Mackenzie, you couldn't buy a cow without offending the herdsman, right? Is that the idea that Mackenzie was so raw of spirit, right? And that he's often described as being of temperament like a madman, right? That he is a wild figure, and for people to have supported him, I think was a risk in and of itself, and yet he had tremendous support.
As a reformer.
As a reformer.
When
as
it
a
came
wild
to taking up arms, it was, I think, a little bit different. But
so to set the stage here, we've got this family compact holding people down. There's talk about reform in the air, and then people have had enough. What was the last straw before we had this armed rebellion?
What was the last straw?
I don't know if you could point to a single trigger. I think it was things and clearly it wasn't a very well planned rebellion. It was almost like a spontaneous popular uprising, because when they do, Mackenzie moves the date forward by a couple days of when he wants this armed rebellion to take place, and one rebel takes about 700 to 800 men up Yonge Street, and they're met by a small picket of about 27 Tories, probably right about where Maple Leaf Gardens is, and there's one volley fired by the Loyalists that responded by a ragged and apparently the people, the mob of sort of armed men, the rebels, they heard the shots, saw people dive for cover. They weren't necessarily killed or wounded, and then they basically disperse. And it starts this race, and their last of the rebel army collects itself at Montgomery's Tavern. I can't remember the date, a couple days later.
December 7th.
December 7th, there we go. Collect at Montgomery's Tavern, and one of the things that's problematic for Mackenzie is that his general, Colonel Anthony Van Egmond, who, by the way, wasn't a colonel and he wasn't a Van Egmond, most of the stuff about himself, he invented this aristocratic military lineage that all of it was, he was outed in 1836 at the 1836 election as somebody who didn't have this great military record, as being on both sides of the Napoleonic Wars and serving in Russia. And he wasn't an aristocratic Van Egmond. In fact, we know what his birth name was. He was probably the closest he got to the armies during the Napoleonic Wars. It's believed that he was a sutler, somebody who sold goods to the army, and he would have heard the stories from the men that fought in these battles that was in the Russian campaign and that sort of thing. But one of his biographers, Major Needler, said it's an awful strange general that takes on the command of an army when he hasn't seen the troops or inspected them or drilled them. In fact, the first and only command he gave to the army was for it to disperse at Montgomery's Tavern. He arrives late. Basically, he arrives...
Which probably wasn't bad advice.
Yeah, which probably at that point, when you've got 1,000 Loyalist militia and British regulars carrying an artillery piece on the Montgomery's Tavern, and you've got some very frightened mob of undisciplined, ill-trained men with pikes and the odd musket, that sort of thing, it probably wasn't bad advice. And apparently Mackenzie put a pistol to his head and said, "Command this army," something to that effect. And there wasn't much to command because the skirmish at Montgomery's Tavern, accounts vary, but it didn't last very long. It was mostly a skirmish, and then you get this flight of rebels to the States, including Mackenzie.
In terms of what that tinderbox moment was, like, I don't know that there's a single event that you could point to, but I would say there is, in addition to that incredible cronyism that they're witnessing, is also... There's profound, especially in this part of the world, there's profound betrayal of early settlers and homesteaders who've arrived out here and who believe that they have been assured that if they can clear a certain amount of land, that they will be able to make a valid claim on that land. And instead what happens is they break their backs, and they break their children's backs, and they break their brothers' and their fathers' backs, and they try to clear pieces of land. They pull out stumps the size of Buicks, and they turn around at the end of it, and they get told, oh no, we've actually given this piece of land to my brother or to my brother-in-law, and we're going to take this parcel that you've now cleared, that is now a fertile working farm, and we're going to take this log cabin that you've built on here with 2 stories and you know the first window in the neighborhood, and we're going to take that and take this land, and we're not going to recompense you because this doesn't belong to you. And there were some people who were meagerly recompensed, but for the most part, people had this land taken from them after they've done that. And I think when they talk about, like, part of why it's called, like, the play is called The Farmers Revolt, is also speaks specifically to that very thing, is you've incensed a people who are hard scrabble trying to carve their way out of the utter wilderness. You know, that there's that wonderful thing, I think you wrote about it once, David, was about how in this period a squirrel could climb a tree in Kingston and not have to get down till it got to Goderich. Right?
On the tree.
The canopy, right? So the density of the canopy, and if you're out there trying to, with no power tools If you're lucky, you might have an oxen or two, but for the most part, you're doing all of this clearing, heavy bush clearing by hand, and then to have somebody show up and tell you that, no, this has been awarded to, Lieutenant this or Colonel that, or we've decided we're going to give this parcel to, the betrayal and the disenfranchisement, right? People lose everything that they have tried to build. And that's not even including the scope of what those people have gone through in coming over as immigrants from, wherever they've been dispossessed of before that, right? I mean, whether they are part of the, people who are being evicted out of farms in Ireland, or whether you have the Scottish settlers who are also, essentially trying to start over, knowing what kind of hard scrabble they're going to hit here, only have it all taken away from them, and then watch these abuses of power, right? I mean, and as David pointed out too, at the same time, to undergo that while the memory of the French Revolution and let them eat cake is still ringing in the back of your head. Like, it's not hard to see how that would rile.
Yeah, well, and the Van Egmond family are classic. They were promised money compensation. Well, John Galt did that, money compensation if they built the Huron roads, schools, and churches, and they were going to flood the Huron tract with settlers. Well, that didn't happen, of course, because John Galt, he was fired. That's another story. I think history's been pretty kind, but a lot of the misunderstanding. Some of it was administrative. When you got your land grant in Montreal, you might have got to Goderich and find out that somebody else had already had it. Some of it was high-handedness by the Canada Company. Like, Canada Company were withholding deeds to people who had cleared the land until the election was over because they thought they might vote against the Canada Company's interests.
Now, the Canada Company was run by the Family Compact?
Well, okay, there's another complex relationship. Yes, yes, it turned out that the Canada Company was run by the Family Compact. Although Thomas Mercer Jones kind of flirted with the reformers, but he ended up marrying John Straughn's daughter, Elizabeth Mary Strachan, and so he had sort of his foot in both camps. And there's a thing with Tiger Dunlop, who were Tories, but in the Huron tract, they were the outsiders. But the Canada Company, they supported, no doubt, they supported the Family Compact. But interesting things emerged after the rebellion. For instance, the militia pay, the Huron Regiment, which was raised during the rebellion in December 1837. Hundreds of men, when the call went out, hundreds of men gathered on the square here in Goderich. They formed companies under the leadership of the local gentry, like Captain Dunlop, the Dunlop brothers, and Captain Longworth, Captain Strawn, John Strawn's son, who was here at the time. They show up, but then they're disbanded, but then they're called back together in January. They spend 90 days on the Sarnia frontier where they perform valuable service. Funny enough, Edward Van Egmond, who was the son of Colonel Anthony Van Egmond, the chief rebel, the rebel general, his son is in charge of the wagon train of the Loyalist militia heading on the way to Sarnia. But there is an issue with pay where Tiger Dunlop thought that Thomas Mercer Jones should compensate, and the Canada Company should compensate until they could get money from the government, from the Crown, to pay for these men who had given up 90 days service. Thomas Mercer Jones said no. Apparently Tiger Dunlop called him a rebel or a traitor or something like that, and that I'm not 100% sure, but there was a duel fought between Dunlop and Thomas Mercer Jones on the river flats here, and I'm going to guess that was the origin of the duel. But yes, the Canada Company was in with the Family Compact, but through Captain Longworth and others, they had connections with the reformers. They were hedging their bets.
Well, who won the duel?
Well, we don't know. You see, it's just a duel that everybody talked about. Well, clearly nobody was injured, but that was the real purpose of all these duels. You were just to show up. You had your second, and if you show up, the idea was that you misfired your pistol or fired in the ground or whatever. The idea was to show up. But we had a lot of duels down here on the river flats. Yeah, probably still do, yeah.
One thing in there, I was going to say too, another important piece is also the profiteering that was happening with some of the private land commission people too. That while there was the Land Commission's office that was awarding people pieces of land, they were also taking a lot of that land and giving it to private interests, who then would turn around. And so where you might think that you're going to get, like one thing that's also spoken to in the play is the idea that a settler could come in and be told for $20 you can get a 100-acre piece of land, but then they go and try to get it and they can't get that piece, but instead they're encountered, instead of seeing an actual governmental representative, they're sent to somebody else who it actually turns out is a private business person who is actually in bed with the commission and has been usually given some compensation to the commission and been given a whole bunch of deeds, and they then turn around and take those $20 100-acre plots and sell them for $200, and then they profiteer off it, right? And that happened over and over and over.
So in this setting, we have some people who decide to take up arms. Who are they? And in short, what do they do?
Well, I mean, the big driver is William Lyon Mackenzie. I mean, Mackenzie is really, he is a highly charged, not only does he have this amazing newspaper, the Advocate, or the Colonial Advocate before that, which is an enormous voice of reform. On top of that, he is known as a great orator too, and actually, continually makes these speeches, and people rally behind him. And it's the thing I was kind of pointing at earlier about the popular support for the rebellion was also that while it may not have had a mass of people in the thousands who joined with Mackenzie and his movement, there were certainly hundreds who were willing to take up arms and rise up against the government. And so while the quantity of that rebellion may have been minimal, the qualitative element of it, the amount that people were actually riled up and dedicated to this cause and willing to die for it, was significant.
So hundreds of people got together behind Mackenzie.
It's good.
Hundreds of people, and that's how you number. I mean, it's interesting here that Colonel Van Egmond rode alone to Toronto, but when the alarm went out, hundreds of men gathered on the square to take up arms against the rebellion. There was a raid here, and I haven't talked about that yet, but in 1838, after the 1838 raid, in June 1838, the raid on Goderich, and after the rebellion, the Lazar sisters, who wrote a really good book on the rebellion called Humors of 37, they said there were but two parties left in Huron County, Tory and Tory. But there were clearly rebels in the area, because when Colonel Van Egmond dies in jail and his body's brought back here to be buried in Egmondville, his sons waved off a salute, musket salute of rebels who wanted, out of respect for the colonel, to fire a salute, and they said no. So there clearly were people who were rebel sympathizers here, but by and large it was the loyalist militia here that turned out in the droves and responded to the rebellion.
So we've got these hundreds of people descending on Toronto for this armed rebellion. Where are they coming from?
That's part of the challenge too. So in theory, they're coming from all over, but one of the challenges was also that one of the leaders of the rebellion, Dr. Rolfe, I'm not blanked on his first name, he actually supposedly changes the date. That the date was supposed to be December 7th, and he changes it to December 4th. And at this time, nobody can send text messages to each other. And so the only way to convey this information is to send messengers running off basically through the woods to tell people who have been coordinating for months to arrive on December 7th. Yes, please?
Do you know how long it would have taken, say, from Goderich or Central Huron to get to Toronto in that time?
I think it took Colonel Van, it was a couple days. They had to get him. They sent, I guess it was Dr. Rolfe sent a messenger to get him, drag him out, and he said, well, it's a little early. And he was, when the rebellion on December 4th, when they go up Yonge Street, first exchange of gunfire, he was still on his way in here. He was here. He got here just in time for the Montgomery's tavern skirmish. So it would have been days. We're not talking like there's no railroad that we're I used
I
to
think
know
it's
that.
3 or 4 days by
Yeah.
horseback. Like from out here, from like, I think from Blythe, as I sort of looked at it this winter, was to go from like Blythe or Seaforth like to Toronto is like 3 or 4 days on horseback at that time.
Yeah, and there were other, like for instance, the other more serious gathering in Upper Canada was around the London districts, just south of London. It was that was called the Western Rising, and Dr. Duncombe, who by the time, and this is how communications, he learned about the disaster for the rebels, and he takes off for the States before, while his army is assembling south of London around Burford. He had 300 or 400 people assembling, waiting for his leadership. He was already in the States, and so he wasn't coming. But a few regular companies from London did, and they dispersed the rebels, and they probably numbered about 300 or 400, which is a significant number of people, but it's not overwhelming.
Well, and an essential piece that we've totally left out too is Lower Canada.
Oh yeah.
That actually just a couple of months prior to the uprising, you actually have a parallel rebellion that had already begun in Lower Canada,
Which is present-day Quebec.
Yeah, so you'd had an uprising already happening there, and there's speculation too that Mackenzie had a plan before December 7th, like actually back in November, to basically to try to raid the armory in Toronto and York at the time, to try to steal all the muskets, because the army at that time was all in Quebec, or in Lower Canada, trying to stop that rebellion there.
Yeah, and certainly in Lower Canada, it's a much more serious rebellion where you get hundreds of soldiers battling hundreds of, patriots, as they were called then. But the church and the British authorities at the time combined, and once again in Lower Canada, predominantly French Catholic, when they think of rebellion and revolution, they think of Americanism, they think of the Reign of Terror, and the church is very adamant that there won't. In fact, rebels weren't allowed to. Rebels who died in the 1837-38 rebellion weren't allowed to be buried on consecrated ground.
Yeah. But for Mackenzie, who is attempting to lead this uprising, I think hearing what was happening, and it seemed prophetic in a way, right? I mean, I think for him it seemed like it was clearly a harbinger of the opportunity that was there for him.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Took advantage of the opportunity to.
So the date has been changed to December 4th for this uprising. I'm just trying to get this clear here.
Right.
December 4th. How many people arrive on December 4th? How many people didn't hear and are arriving on December 7th?
Well, and lots. I mean, like it ends up really being that there's no, like the army, the militia that attempts to, the rebellion that attempts to arrive, arrives in this scattershot way, right? They don't have an opportunity to really organize themselves. And then on top of that too, like for the most part, they are not a trained army in any way. I mean, they are farmers.
So they didn't train beforehand?
Well, I mean, they trained as best as they could, but without like military leadership, right? They've never encountered a drill sergeant in their lives. So one of the things they talk about, for instance, is like the first kind of wave of rebel army. They try to form ranks, and they try to march in line. They try to advance, and they come up against the first line, and so the first row fired their muskets and then fell to the ground so the next row could fire theirs, but the second row thought that the first row had all been shot dead, so they turn and run away because they don't know, because they're not trained. They're not trained soldiers. They don't know what they're encountering, right? And then on top of that too, like they do not have a musket to a man as they're walking into this either, right? There's still plenty of them that are walking into this, well, taking on a standing British army with artillery, and some of them have pitchforks in their hands.
But that would, can I just balance that out? I mean, the Huron militia here, a lot of them didn't have muskets either. In fact, the blacksmith here, George Vivian, was hammering out pikes and anything that could be used as weapons. It's almost like a feudal levy. more than a trained militia where everyone, when the bell rang here, every able-bodied male over the age of 16 who could carry a weapon showed up at the square, and they're rummaging around, and then basically they're just saying, okay, 50 people are in a company according to the rule book here, and they basically organize on that. And as Jill said, combat's a terrifying experience. And British line infantry in the 19th century, it took a lot of guts to stare another set of muzzles in the face and not move. There's no that type of discipline. The only place that exists is in the British Army. Neither the Loyalist militia or the rebel militia would have had the type of training that would have allowed them to stand and slog it out on line infantry battles.
Yeah, and the reality is too, at that point, warfare is not remotely what, I mean, we think of even the wars that we have seen televised or watched in movies and stuff. I mean, you're talking about an era where the reliability of a musket is so minimal. I mean, the reality is these are people who are having to stab each other and fight it out fisticuffs. You know, it's brutal. It's brutal.
Yeah, you actually had to get right up close and see the person you were pulling the trigger on, or get right up close and stab the person you were going to kill, and like pushing a button in the Indian Ocean and a cruise missile flies 2,000 miles or something.
Yeah.
So this scattershot troop arrives in Toronto. What do they try to accomplish once they get there? What is their goal?
I think that go ahead.
Well, they wanted the Legislative Assembly. They wanted to take over
Yes.
mechanics of government. Basically, it was an attempted coup. Really.
So did they descend on the Assembly?
Yeah, they didn't get there. The Army. They didn't get to the Army because they were 27. A Loyalist militia of 27. Like I said, that would be the Yonge Street skirmish, where about, like I said, the Maple Leaf Gardens. At kind of ended, they scattered because once again they realized, oh my God, this is for real, and a lot of them scattered. And this is where it's hard to know at Montgomery's Tavern how many of those guys that marched up Yonge Street show up at have the determination to show up at Montgomery's Tavern. How many of those people at Montgomery's Tavern were just coming in? They heard about the rebellion and were coming in to assemble there. It's hard to know. We do know that a lot of the hardcore rebels knew that they'd made a big mistake, and very quickly the rebellion falls apart, and a lot of them end up, you might have heard of the Navy Island thing in December 1830, where they set up the Republic of Canada and Lower Canada because they have an American-type flag, except it's got 2 stars in the upper quadrant, and you get the international incident with the Carolina, where the Carolina was an American ship. The cause was taken up in the States. A lot of Americans in the U.S. saw that what was happening in Upper Canada was striking a blow against British tyranny, and remember, it's the age of manifest destiny, and there were large numbers of people who were willing to volunteer to come and liberate Canada from British rule. And after the rebellion, it kind of shifts where it becomes a real fight for Canada, because we have these large numbers of invaders that come across the border. I think between here and York, there's a professor that wrote a book called The Patriots' War about the 1838-39 aftermath, where they start raiding here.
Maybe let's not get ahead to that part just yet. We'll get to that in a second.
But a lot of them leave, and a lot of them were Americans that marched up Yonge Street. A lot of them in Buffalo. It was really, really. I guess that's the point I was trying to make. A lot of them, people in Buffalo, had heard what was happening in York and wanted to assemble. In fact, my old professor, Colin Reed, who wrote the uprising, the Western Uprising, he said he probably figures nearly half were American-born of the rebels that marched up Yonge Street.
Really?
Yeah.
So on December 4th, probably.
Yeah, because it would have been a lot easier to get the word from Buffalo and have those people come up than it would be, say, to Huron County to have rebels pour in from here.
Okay.
I think importantly too, like one of the Mackenzie things that really strikes me is Mackenzie was also a highly literate man. And one thing we talked about early in rehearsal was also the idea that you could be a highly literate person in that period. It was entirely possible that you could have read every single thing that was in print, right? That there's a very limited number of books that are in print in that period, and you could have read them all, right? And it's important to recognize, too, from Mackenzie, and I think not unlike, when we talk about the echo chamber of information that each of us are living in right now, right? And the divisive politics that we're experiencing right now. And I think in many ways, Mackenzie became so insulated from divergent opinion that I don't know that when he marched on York that he really believed that they were going to have to, that there would be as much bloodshed. I think that in many ways he thought that he was walking in on a vanguard of a change of power that was going to be largely anticipated and understood, and that it was going that the list of demands that would be there, that the shift towards responsible government away from what the tyranny that he saw, that it was going to be an inevitable thing. I think he, in many ways, believed himself to be part of inevitable change and didn't necessarily recognize the enormous resistance that would be there.
Wow, a delusional politician.
Yeah, who knew, eh? Well, it's fascinating. Well, and especially
But you're
like,
right. You're absolutely right. I think that's bang on.
Yeah, and on the other side of especially the French Revolution, like you look at things like all the Romantic poets, right? Like Shelley. Shelley is writing about the Revolution, right? Shelley is writing about Napoleon. You also have, Coleridge. You have, all of these great poets that people are reading, and certainly that Mackenzie would have been reading. All of them are writing about the glory of the revolution that has happened in France, right?
Until the Reign of Terror.
Until the Reign of Terror.
And then people and you see even the Romantics are divided up between the revolutionaries and the Tories, like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and all that stuff are arch Tories. Mm-hmm. Even Coleridge and all those people, a lot of them were bristled at the Reign of Terror and Robespierre and the guillotine. But at first, I think, who was it that said that it was heaven to be born, and that when they saw that the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and they thought a brand new day had, much like intellectuals greeted the Russian Revolution in 1917 until the Stalinist era and that sort of thing, people embraced the French Revolution and its ideals until the Reign of Terror between 1792 and 94, and they realized that maybe it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. But then there are other people who maintain that the French revolutionary ideals, they might have gone off the rails during the French Revolution, but they were still good.
Right. Yeah, precisely.
Okay. So, on December 4th, rebels arrive in Toronto. Shots are fired, they scatter. They gather again on December 7th in a tavern.
Well, I think it's sort of more like a sputtering. So like from December 4th right through to the 7th, there's a continual sputtering. And part of what happens is also that the rebel forces, the ranks cannot actually grow because more people do arrive, but as people are arriving, others are fleeing, right? So you don't actually have a replenishing of the rebel ranks in any way. And at the same time, you do have a growing of the loyalist ranks that are there. And then on top, there's some important pieces of if you're talking about the actual warfare, like one of the most interesting pieces, I think, or the closest thing that the rebels had to a strategic maneuver in it all was at one point they send off a separate force, some of their people to go and burn the bridge, the bridge over the Don Valley. And that they send enough people and try to set fire to the bridge in such a way that it actually will draw off a significant number of the British, and they do succeed at doing that, but it's not enough to remotely turn the tide, right?
So they face,
and ultimately the leader of that will be hanged. So
they face 27 people on the first day, on December 4th. That's who they're up against, right? It's a militia of 27 people.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
And that scatters them.
The march up Yonge Street, yeah.
So then on the 7th, who do they face when they're at this bar? What's left of the rebels or the new rebels who have arrived or whoever's left are gathered at this bar. There's a few hundred of them at the bar?
See, I'm not sure what the numbers were at Montgomery's Tavern, but it was basically an army in name only. It was basically rabbles of people showing up there. Some might have taken part in the Yonge Street skirmish. Some were coming in, and I can't help but think a lot of people would have been on their way to Toronto to support the rebels with their pike or their musket and realized the rebellion's been crushed and decided, I'm going to go home.
Because they didn't get the tweet.
They didn't get the text. And it's not a good idea to be caught in an act of treason or rebellion.
Good idea.
Yeah. Like there's certainly no roles. Like they don't have there's nobody's taking attendance when they get there, right? They don't know who's there.
So who shows up to finish them off? Is it another 27 militia?
Well, this time it's 1,000 or 800 to a column of about 8. I think it was Lieutenant Colonel James Fitzgibbon of the War of 1812 fame. The officer who Laura Secord gave her report about the Americans at Beaver Dam, he marches up onto Montgomery's Tavern with maybe 800 to 1,000 militia, loyalist militia, and he's dragging a cannon with him. And
So there's no chance.
there's no chance. They've already, and in the event, like I said, the skirmish that happens at Montgomery's Tavern is very brief, under an hour, maybe not even that.
They still fight.
Well, a few of them, like it's a skirmish. There's not line on line fighting, but I guess there's shots exchanged because I think people were killed there, at least wounded at Montgomery, and then they torched the tavern, of course.
Mm-hmm. And that was the end of the rebellion.
Yeah, they're scattering, and they're tracing down for the next couple of days and maybe weeks. They're trying to track down rebels, like in the London district. They're trying to track down some of Colonel Duncombe or Captain Duncombe's people in Toronto. They're trying to track down. They really, when they get Van Egmond, they really don't know if this is the guy that's the rebel general. They had to have. They brought him into a dying rebel and asked him to identify Colonel Van Egmond, and he did. On his deathbed, identified him as the rebel general.
Van Egmond was more than willing to give up his title and name again.
Yeah, well, he died in a couple weeks later, a sick, very tired, probably humiliated old man.
In prison.
Yeah, in prison, just a couple weeks after the rebellion. There's no doubt, though, that he probably would have been dangling at the end of a rope very shortly. Anyway,
And they end up hanging 25 rebels. You know, I think there's 250 who are incarcerated between Fort Henry and in Toronto, and there's 25 that are hung. And then of the lower, we were just looking at this today in rehearsal actually, and in Lower Canada they hung 12.
Wow.
They hanged 12. They hanged.
now that 25 that they hanged, does that include the ones like the Americans, like at Prescott at the Battle of the Windmill?
That I don't know.
And they hanged about 3 or 4 in London at the county courthouse in London, and some they sent to Australia, Van Diemen's Land. Over almost 200 they sent to Van Diemen's Land in Lower and Upper Canada, and at least one, William Jackman, from London was exiled to West Wawanosh.
That'll learn him.
And his great-great-grandson,
Not so
ironically, his great-great-grandson became Hal Jackman, who was the Queen's representative in Ontario in the early 1990s.
So that's the rebellion in a nutshell, I guess. Gil, does anybody have any questions specifically about the events? So, go ahead.
So, David and Gil, thank you for this, by the way. You haven't mentioned too much about the social factors of where the religious affiliations were pretty important too, weren't they?
Oh, for sure.
And drink. Wasn't whiskey a fairly major factor?
Well, drink is a major factor in this whole period. I mean, like on several levels. So one, like you don't have a reliable source of clean drinking water of any kind for anybody at this point in time, really, and that's major. So it means that every single family, all people are drinking all day, right? Like it's a common thing for instance, especially in towns, for children to be sent to go and get the daily bucket of beer for the family, right? Because everybody is drinking all of the time, and yeah, the scale of the whiskey drinking. Well, I mean, here in this museum too are those Tiger Dunlop's 12 Apostles, right? Does everybody know about his 12 Apostles? Yeah, the nodding. So I mean, they've got them here. I mean,
it's 11 bottles of whiskey and 1 bottle of water that he called Judas.
Yeah, which is incredible, and yeah, the scope of the drinking that everybody was doing in that period. I mean, and especially also traveling in the winter when you're drunk is also something that was like the whole, I mean, when they talk about things like falling off the wagon, right? I mean, that had at one time a literal meaning, was you were so drunk you fell off the wagon. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
The other social factors.
Well,
sure.
and Gil touched the whiskey drinking, which was just legend. alcoholism or alcohol as a problem doesn't begin until about the Industrial Revolution, when people switched from horse-drawn plows and to automation. It's not until really the late 19th century that people see alcoholism, or what we would consider drunkenness, as a huge problem. But to your religious question,
Yeah, it's important.
that was huge in this area. Like the divisions, not just between Catholic and Protestant, but between, say, the Church of Scotland and the Church of England against the Methodists. Methodism is spreading through Upper Canada like wildfire. There's 5 types of Methodist church here, and it's got the taint of Americanism. And in fact, in this area, there was a real push to get an Anglican, a Church of England, because almost all these people were Church of England when they came, but within a few years they're Methodists. And the Methodist Church just grows in leaps and bounds, and the Canada Company actually tried to keep a Methodist circuit rider out of the area because he was spreading all these weird religious doctrines, evangelical type doctrines, which were just totally flew in the face of the established churches. And as the denominational loyalties and the denominational tensions had a huge impact on everything: politics, who you hung out with, who you married, what school you went to. It was just tremendous.
Well, and then the complication of marriage itself. I mean, just in terms of the scarcity of women in the colony too. I mean, this was a huge point for a lot of the people on all sides, the reformers as well as the Tories. Was people? I mean, it was like an election platform. There's actually a beautiful section of a speech that Sir Francis Bondhead gives in the show, and it's a transcript from Election Day. And one of the things he says is men, women, and money is what you want. And if you elect me, I will make sure that there are more women in this colony, right? Like, because you and on top of that too, you had these, the mail order brides that were happening in that period too. I mean, you had farmers who were, sending away essentially for young women and not just young women, to come to the colony to be able to marry them, and a lot of that was happening too. You had people who were marrying, their mail order bride within weeks of their arrival in the colony, having never met each other's families, having absolutely no relationship of any kind. You'd arrive, they'd pick you up from where the wagon had dropped you off, and you'd go to the church and get married within a matter of days. And sight unseen.
Yeah, and they had to. It was just procreating the species, because it's estimated about 1 in 3 people died on the way over here and that sort of thing. And you had to, people didn't marry for love or romance. That's an upper middle class type notion. They married because of economic necessity. And remember, there's no health care, welfare. You had to have kids because you looked after the kids, and as you bred your workforce, and as you aged, your kids would marry, and you'd hope they looked after you in old age, and it just kind of on and went. You had to marry, you had to procreate, and which makes life here. And if a husband or wife died, there was a real push on to marry somebody really, really quickly. Like if you look at old censuses and that sort of thing, you see how quickly families blend and that sort of thing.
So,
Yes, Allison.
yes.
I have a question about the date they had this uprising. I mean, I think back to what it was like in Huron County even 50 years ago in December. What kind of poor judgment to plan an uprising in December.
Absolutely. It was a spontaneous, not very well thought out. Gil's absolutely right. Mackenzie is brilliant. I think he boasts that he reads, when he was a kid, he read a book a day or something like that. He just is a voracious reader, absorbed everything. The one thing he wasn't very good at was planning military campaigns.
And then the other piece too, like the one practical part of it would be if you are relying on an army that is mostly composed of farmers, you sure as hell can't have your uprising in April or May, or you can't have it in September or October, or you've got a limited scope of what, July wouldn't be so bad, but yeah, you've got a limited number of opportunities there in the year.
Yeah, good point.
So, yes?
What's prevented the United States from getting involved in this, you mentioned Manifest Destiny, and that was a concern. I mean, that was a concern even after the American Civil War, that at that point they would move in. What stopped them, and why wouldn't the rebels in effect have sent out feelers to the Americans who probably would have been willing to get involved?
All right. Well, actually, the rebels did put out feelers to the Americans. A lot of Americans responded to the call. Like, I mean, I think rebels like Charles Duncombe went and made speeches, especially along the Great Lakes City, and it became kind of like a cause celeb.
Is that collusion?
Oh, for sure. Like, I mean, yeah. They put out a call. They did exactly that, and they got a response in the spring of 1838 from a lot of Americans. But at the official level, cooler heads prevailed. And at that time, in 1836, Martin Van Buren, I think, was president, and the United States really didn't want to take on the British Empire. Even then, although there's always the problem of defending Upper Canada for the British military planners. The great Duke of Wellington called Canada all frontier and nothing else. He had a real keen interest in the 1830s. Right until he died, he was very emotional about Canada and protecting Canada from American republicanism. He's really interested in Canadian defense matters, but he realizes it's a nightmare. On the other hand, for the Americans, going to war with an entity like the British Empire, America was still feeling its wings internationally, sort of thing. They still didn't see themselves as a superpower, and they weren't quite prepared at the official level to take on the British Empire. In fact, President Van Buren makes it very clear that he wasn't going to tolerate acts of piracy or invasion of Upper Canada, because that's exactly what we get in the spring of 1838. Until the first raid in 1838. Now can I talk about that?
Yeah.
Okay. The first raid on Upper Canada is right here in Goderich on June 26, 1838. Hunters' lodges, they were called, which were kind of like Masonic in kind of their ritual and handshakes and grips and words. They formed during the winter of 1837-38 after the hanging of Matthews and Blount.
Yeah, Matthews and Blount, Samuel Blount. Yeah.
In April, they become like
two of the people involved in the rebellion.
They become martyrs to like Canadian liberty, and a lot of Americans join these hunters' lodges. And I think between here and York, in the summer of 1838, starting here in Goderich, there's about 14 incursions of Americans onto Canadian soil. The last and most serious one was in Prescott in November 1838. It becomes known as the Battle of the Windmill, where dozens of they call it the Windmill the Alamo of the North. And there's a really serious, more than the skirmish, it was a siege that lasted a couple of days, the stone windmill up at Prescott. I think about 50 Americans died, and maybe a dozen British regular troops and Canadian militia were killed in the Battle of the Siege. When they finally surrender, about 150 rebels surrender, and then after that, there's no more of those type of cross-border incursions. But the first one here, Colonel John Vreeland steamed in here, about 36.
Here in Goderich.
Here in Goderich, yeah. It's the only time Huron County soil has been violated by a foreign invader, at least in the European era, since 1827, was when the hunters' lodges they sacked. Now, some of them on board the boat that landed with Colonel Vreeland might have really thought that they were striking a blow against British liberty or against British tyranny, but most of them seemed bent on plunder because they carted off the stores in the Canada Company wharf. They were caught a couple days later on Walpole Island in an aborted raid on the trading post there. An American revenue cutter they said you could take your chances with the natives, the Ojibwa down on Walpole Island, who were very upset with them, most upset, or you can clamber aboard our revenue cutter and we're going to take you. And he was charged, I think, with piracy. And Colonel Vreeland was sentenced to a year in jail, and a couple of his other thugs. A lot of them just kind of melted away or escaped. It's a good thing they were caught in the States, because if they were caught on British soil, the penalty for piracy was, death by hanging.
So this gives us an idea of what happened in the rebellion. Gil, how does the play tackle this? What does the play look like?
This is a great question. So one of the things that I talked about on our very first day of rehearsal was actually the idea that I don't think that this play, 1837, The Farmers Revolt, is really a history play. I think that what it is a mythology. And one of the things that Paul Thompson, who was one of the creators of the show, and a lot of you will be familiar with his work, one of the things that Paul has talked extensively about was the idea that when they were first creating shows like the Farm Show and 1837 and the Duke of Boris, a bunch of the early shows that helped to inspire the creation of the Blyth Festival itself, that at that time, what they were setting out consciously to do was to try to create a Canadian mythology, that we need myths, that myths are what underpin a culture and a society. And that they turned to this subject matter of 1837 in an effort to try to create a Canadian mythology. So there are, of course, wild inaccuracies, or there are, and I would say that even in the production itself and what we're doing, there's a lot of stuff that we're doing that is very anachronistic, right? You're not going to go and see a show that has beautiful, perfect period costumes, that has like highly detailed period props and sets, and this is very much a show that recognizes that it was built as part of a theater movement, really, a movement of storytelling and a movement of an attempt to try to say that, especially coming out of when the play was initially created, 1972. And I don't know if everybody in this room knows this, but part of the play was actually written at Blyth Festival in the theater itself. And actually at the time, the building, the theater in Blyth, was all but condemned, and you actually weren't allowed to go upstairs. You could go down in the lower hall, but no one was allowed to be upstairs. And it was because the roof was caving in. And the actors and Rick Salutin and the whole gang arrived in Blyth, and they wanted to use the theater to write, and they were told, you can't. And they actually had to sign waivers with the township that if the roof fell on their head, they wouldn't sue them. And so that's how they got permission to use the theater to be able to work on this project. And but what they were really attempting to do was to say, at that point in time, like looking at theater across this country, they were looking at things like what was happening at the Stratford Festival, and they were looking at things like what was happening at the Shaw Festival, and they were saying, well, hang on a second, why do we have all these Canadians who are going to see plays that are about dead British kings and queens, and why are we engaging in this kind of a relationship to our history? Why are we not actually attempting to tell some of the stories from our own trajectory? And so that, in many ways, was what underpinned the creation of the play in the first place, or the inspiration for it. And so and history, I mean, and David is very familiar with this too, is the idea that also history, as much as it points us at things, there is also so much that is unknowable about it. And that in reality, there can never be a pure history. There's no such thing, right? There's only historiography, right? You could only ever read what is written about history. You can't ever read history. History itself doesn't exist. There's only what people think about it and what people have written about it. And in that same way, this play, 1837, The Farmers Revolt, is really a play that is about this place. It's about there's some powerful scenes in there. For instance, like Colonel Van Egmond appears in the show, as does Tiger Dunlop is in the show. I mean, obviously William Lyon Mackenzie is in the show, and an incredible turn too by a young performer who's with us this year named Matthew Ginn, who's absolutely brilliant as Mackenzie. The show is really quite an extraordinary testament to the importance of telling our own stories, and I think that's woven all through it. And on top of that, the idea that, like as we were pointing to here, the facts of the rebellion occupy a degree of the story, but even as David was pointing out, like the social events, like for instance in the first act, there's a lot of stuff that happens that is not directly seemingly tied to the rebellion. So things like there is a mail order bride scene. where there is a young man who goes to pick up the woman he's sent away for. And there's also, there's a scene of, for instance, a British high-class diarist who has arrived, and she's in mid-transit from traveling from Toronto to Niagara-on-the-Lake, and she's writing in her diary about the experience that she's had, and it points to things like Susanna Moodie and Roughing It in the Bush and stuff like that. And so there's all of these little pieces that set up the world that we are living in advance of the rebellion itself. And I would say, it's fascinating being in the room with these brilliant, incredible actors. There's another one of our actors who's here tonight, actually, Omar Alex Khan over there in the corner, who may have an incredible Scottish accent, it turns out. But they together, they're so compelling. And I have to tell you, every single day, there's a triumphant speech near the end of Act 1 where Mackenzie calls for people to come up and sign their names to commit to rise up against the government. And every day, I'm pretty much ready to get up out of my chair and go and sign up with him. It's really quite extraordinary. But I would say that the play itself is also about there's a I can't give away the final line. I can't give away the final line, can I, Omar? No, I can't. The final line, I think, is one of the greatest lines in Canadian theater. It's a line that actually when you've got it at home in print, if you go home and read that final line, it's an incredible final line, and I think it speaks to the great project. While Mackenzie is definitely a radical reformer, for all of us, the society that we live in today is wildly more liberal than what even he was proposing, right? I mean, to consider that somehow he would be viewed as this radical reformer who was involved in this uprising. A lot of the things that we take for granted in our government today are things that he was willing to take up arms and fight for almost 200 years ago. I think that's a fair statement, isn't it, David?
And it's amazing what hasn't changed, though. But yeah. Very good. Yeah, very good. Very well stated. Very good.
So,
Actually,
yes.
what hasn't changed is the family, the units that you were discussing. The
Family compact?
Family compact?
Yeah, is that still in practice today?
Well, not those people, but if you read Peter C. Newman's book, the what is it called, The Establishment?
Yes. So
I mean, the Canadian establishment. It's still maybe not run out of Montreal anymore or Westmount, but a lot of people would argue there's still about 250 families in Canada that still control a lot of have a lot of political and economic clout.
Well, and the wild abuses of power that we're witnessing, I mean, that continue to happen too. I mean, even looking at something like what's happening in the States right now too. I mean, how can you not look at the States? Also, like somebody like Scott Pruitt, somebody like that, who just stuffing his pockets, lining his pockets day after day after day, and everybody sort of turns a blind eye while the agenda is being served until it finally reaches a point of actual tremendous embarrassment. But the idea of politicians this viciously profiteering, I mean, it's right at the fore of the zeitgeist right now for sure. This.
Do you still want to get involved in politics?
Well, with money like that on the table, but yeah, you bet. But I will have to say, defend politicians and that sort of thing. It's a lot more difficult to work your way into those positions, especially at the municipal level.
I forgot in my introduction to say that David has been a councillor for Goderich for a long time and is now running for mayor.
I'm not a councillor now.
No.
There's a wonderful line in the play too, where actually Van Egmond says to Tiger Dunlop, he complains about the mushroom aristocrats, and the idea that they just keep like popping up, right? They just keep coming up through the soil, these mushroom aristocrats, and I think that that's a big part of what they're dealing with in that period, and also the tremendous, I mean, we haven't spoken about this at all either, like the tremendous poverty that people are living in this part of the world at that point in time, right? I mean, they're living in incredible poverty. And at the same time, I mean, again, the abuses of power at the family compact, like you have, is it the Jarvis brothers? I think it's the Jarvis brothers who, I mean, are running up insane expenses. You know, they're charging to the government things like, you know, they buy themselves shimmering velvet curtains that they, you know, charge to the government. They buy themselves the finest, you know, what's the name of that? At the AGO, the first brick house.
Oh, the Grange.
The Grange, yeah, which was the Boltons, yeah. So one of the Bolton's sons, who was part of the family compact, built in Upper Canada at the time, in Toronto, built what's now attached to the AGO, the first brick house in Upper Canada at the time. And I mean, you literally have people living, I mean, in such extreme poverty, trying to eke out any kind of sustenance farming to be able to keep themselves alive. And then at the same time, you have a kind of, you do have a body that is in control of power and who are living lavishly.
Oh, yes?
A couple of points. When the militia supposedly were heading down to the border to keep Mackenzie from getting back, they supposedly in this area stopped at every farm and had the head of the household swear his allegiance to the crown. And when they were done, there were no dissenters, but Egmont was the only rebel in our county.
Who wouldn't swear allegiance?
What would you do if the militia came into your yard? I guess you'd say. Now the other point, apparently they were watching for Mackenzie trying to get back into the States. And there was a rumor that he hid out up on the 16th concession in Goderich Township. Now, nothing I've ever found to substantiate that, but one of the guys that escaped with him to the States was named William Hall. And in 1845, he was granted amnesty along with all the rest of the rebels. He comes back over here with a barge or a raft of lumber north of Bayfield, builds a big house, buys 3 farms from Malcolm Cameron, and establishes a mill, a woolen mill down in the ravine, water powered. And by the time they formed the Bayfield Cemetery Company, he's got the biggest number of shares in it. Like, he didn't get involved in politics, but he came back to that particular spot, and the rumor was that's where they escaped by boat to go to the States. Now I've been digging into this because we ended up buying one of those farms in 1979, but can't verify any of it.
Interesting.
Anybody ever hear of the hiding out in Goderich Township?
Well, no, I think his movements, after he escapes to the United States, his movements are pretty well documented because he's constantly...
But before going to the United States, on his way to the United States.
What year was this, Phil?
Well,
you said 1845?
He came back in 1845.
Well, William Hall did, but Mackenzie's still in the States until 1849 when he's given a pardon.
Yeah, but on his way, running away from the rebellion to the United States?
Well, they were on an island.
Yeah, they were on Navy Island, and I think he went to Buffalo, and he gave Mackenzie did. I don't know about William Hall, but Mackenzie gave speeches, and I think his movements and where he was are pretty well known. There wouldn't be any reason for him to have to come up here, and it'd be an awfully dangerous, because like I said, this is devoutly loyal territory. It'd be awfully dangerous for Mackenzie to try to hide out, even in a remote place like Huron County, just because the loyalties were so strong at that time. I mean, it's an interesting story, and I'd be interested if there was anything more than...
And it might be a great myth that we can work into the mythology, the local mythology. So,
but apparently, even the militia didn't find any sympathizers besides Benhaven. But apparently, there were lots of them up here.
I'm sure. Like I hadn't heard that they went and asked for a loyalty oath, but it doesn't surprise me. And of course, as you know, like as you said, that it'd be awfully dangerous not to swear that loyalty oath.
Because the theory was that all these participants, after the first big kerfuffle, headed for home, pretended they were there the whole time.
Yeah, good advice.
Yeah, or some of them also doubled back and joined up with the ranks who were searching too. And there's instances of that as well.
So we've covered what happened at the rebellion, what the play might look like. Just finally, before we're done here, we're done very soon. Why is this play relevant today? I'll ask both of you.
I'll let you answer that first. I mean, I think you had a good answer for that.
Well, I mean, there's so many reasons. Wow. Well, for one, I mean, I would point to one of my favorite quotes about a play. There's a wonderful writer named David Mamet. Actually, I keep crediting it to Mamet, though I haven't been able to find out where he actually wrote it. But is that any play that can be described in 1 minute should be 1 minute long. This is a very complex play. It's got all kinds of wildness of storytelling. There's a lot of it, especially in the first act, is very, very funny. And the second act, things really turn on a dime. But I would say that it's very much a play about idealism and a play about attempting to speak truth to power. And I think that the era that we are living in right at the moment, we're actually seeing a tremendous necessity for that kind of rallying of spirit and voice, that we need to be able to be, it's that fascinating. I think one of the things that Mackenzie was so essential in inspiring in people was the necessity to criticize the government that they were living under, which is something that we all need to be doing, regardless of whether there are people we voted for or people we didn't vote for. We need to be critical of our governments. I mean, how else can we possibly grow as a society? That's what we need, right? We all need, in the same way that, like, every play that goes up at the theater, I get lots of letters from people who write me letters about things they loved and things they didn't. And then I also get, reviewers who write pieces about what they think of the shows, and these kinds of criticisms are the things that allow the theater to grow. They're actually the things that allow me to grow as an artist. They're the things that allow for us to better learn who our audience is and what our audience is interested in and what our audience's needs are. And I think in many ways, governments need to be held accountable in the same way. It's incredibly dangerous to live in a society where people don't feel they have a voice. And I think that that's more so than anything what Mackenzie really was attempting to rally people around, was the necessity to try to seize some power for people who were being trampled and ignored. And his tactics, I would not propose that bloodshed is ever an appropriate political response. At the same time, I would say that this is very much a play that is relevant to us because we're Canadian, and this is a very important Canadian story, regardless of its outcome. And I would also say that we are living in volatile political times. all over the world right now. And I think it's important for us to recognize too, and I think one of the things Mackenzie speaks to in the play so articulately is also that as much as we would love it to be true, there is no such thing as an apolitical position, right? You cannot choose to not be a political person. That's not an opportunity that any of us have. If you're not engaged in politics, you are still engaged in politics. You're just part of that silent silent immobile voice. But you're still being counted, right? We all of us have to be a part of the political landscape that we live in, and it's not actually a choice that we have. We have to be, and we are, whether we like it or not. And I think that part of what Mackenzie was attempting to do, and part of what this play also tries to do, is to say, make choices and be conscious and try to be as awake as we can in the times in which we're living. And that's pretty relevant, wouldn't you say? I think so.
Well, everything that Gil said, I agree with, but it's kind of relevant for one reason, the idea of truth to power, but we're living in an age of populism now. And we're on the verge of these kind of like electoral revolutions, like the Brexit vote, the Trump presidency, and even on a local level, a lot of people would argue that the election of Mr. Ford as premier is part of that populist swing. And not always are populist revolutions, are they clean or they're messy or they seem to... And this is another example like the Mackenzie rebellion where, looking back from my perspective, I'm kind of glad it didn't succeed. But I like the idea that somebody's dredging up this event, an incredibly important watershed event in our history, and putting it on display for people to talk about. Because one of the things I fear we've lost in the 21st century is something that when the play was written in the 1970s was vitally important. I remember going to school in the 1970s and we were in this constant search for a national identity, a distinct national identity. And that lasted probably from about the flag debate until about I started coming into teaching. Now we don't even look at that anymore. We don't have we've kind of lost or we're losing our roots of what it meant to be a Canadian at one time, and some of the important incidents. I don't even think they study the Mackenzie Revolt in grade 7 and 8 social sciences anymore. It's a lot of other stuff. So it's really important that we kind of have, and I'm really glad that Gil is able to put on a play like this to put, as I said, to put on display. And the Blyth Festival Theatre does a great job of trying to holding up a mirror to who we are, not just in 1837, 38, but who we are today and what we are now. And I think the play kind of, even though it's about something that happened 180 years ago, and it reflects kind of like a late 20th century perspective, it's kind of really important that we come out after we see it and think, gee, how does this relate to the recent elections in the States, Great Britain, or here? Anyway, I'm looking forward to the play and can hardly wait.
And so, Gil, when does the play open? When can we go see it?
The play opens first preview is August 1st, and then the play actually opens August 3rd. And it runs all the way until September 15th. And something I would point out to that too, something we've been trying to do, and if any of you, I know there's some teachers and former teachers in this crowd, I've been trying to get the old Avon-Maitland School Board to pay attention and send some students to come and see this thing, and so far I've not had a single school group bite into that amazing opportunity. So if you have any way of turning the thumb screws at the old Board of Ed, please do so. Thank you.
Okay. So on behalf of the museum and the Blyth Festival, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you very much. Discussions like this are great and important for us. And I'd like to thank Gil and David for joining us tonight. Could we give them a round of applause?
That was a discussion about 1837, the Farmers Revolt in Blyth, Ontario. Next time, a conversation with designer Siobhan Sleeth. The music for this podcast is by Vern Good, with voiceover by Gabriel Cromley. please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a review. It'll help get the word out about this podcast and share the history of theatre design in Canada. And you can follow us on Twitter at TheTitleBlock.ca and on Facebook.com/TheTitleBlock Podcast. You can send comments and requests by email to thetitleBlock@gmail.com. Now, don't forget that if you like the show, please support us on Patreon.com. And I'm Michael Kruse, and I'll see you next time on The Title Block.